One of these films was the original sequel to one of the most famous horror movies of all time. But even with Tobe Hooper returning as director and producer, the wacky comedic tone makes it a divisive entry in the series to this day. Another of these films elected to ignore both the initial franchise and the Remakes timeline, acting again as a direct sequel to the original movie. The last of these films once again ignores the initial franchise, the remake timeline, and the new timeline established by Texas Chainsaw 3D and the prequel film Leatherface, because legacy sequels are all the rage now. But which is the best? When the Texas Chainsaw Massacre first released in 1974, it understandably garnered a reputation as a grisly, shocking piece of cinema. However, the film's creator, Tobe Hooper, has always maintained that, beneath all the chicken feathers and all the endless screaming of the name Jerry, the film is actually a black comedy.
The film which you are about to see is an account of the tragedy which befell a group of 5 youths.
The whole "this is a true story" was supposed to be a riff on the political landscape of lies that plagued America in the early 70s. The dysfunctional Sawyer family can be seen as a very strange parody of the typical American family. But even with the filmmaker's thoughts in mind, I rewatched the original recently and still did not really feel the humour. So, in order to hammer it home for idiots like myself, Hooper swapped the mallet for a squeaky toy and set out to make the sequel an overtly ridiculous affair. The poster itself is a parody of The Breakfast Club. I mean, that says it all, but let's get into it regardless. The first act of the original film is some of the finest work in the history of the genre. Slow, brooding, and uncomfortable, making perfect use of sound effects, grim voiceovers, and even more grim visuals. If you want to teach people about cinematic atmosphere, well, look no further. The Texas Chainsaw Massacre 2 says balls to that. The delivery of the opening voiceover is purposefully tacky.
They could find no killers and no victims, no facts, no crime.
And then it launches into a soundtrack that is so on-the-nose spooky, it belongs in a no-budget attempt at a kid's haunted house. When we finally get to the footage, Hooper bombards us with 2 yuppie bastards shooting up mailboxes. And that's it. From there to the very end, this film has no intentions of slowing down, shutting up, or being any less madcap. The punks call in to a radio station's request line to raise some havoc with local DJ Stretch, played by Caroline Williams. Stretch and her colleague LG struggle to disconnect the punks and are forced to wait until the twats hang up themselves, which is frankly just a terrible setup for a radio station. Then again, I'll be the first to admit I don't know a single thing about 1980s radio systems, or yuppies, or women named Stretch. Who cares, as this eventually works out well for both the DJ and us, the audience. Indeed, the yuppies played chicken with the wrong car. Later that night, whilst disturbing Stretch once again, the same car ambushes them on the longest bridge in Texas. What unfolds is an absolutely glorious scene. Leatherface stands tall and proud, hiding behind the upheld corpse of the hitchhiker from the first film. The effect is weird, uncanny, and instantly pulled me into the film the first time I saw it. The high-speed madness is heard in full by Stretch, who smartly captures the audio on a cassette tape. As the sun rises, so does the film, as we are treated to our first glimpse of Hopper, Texas Ranger. This is Lefty, a relative of Sally and Franklin from the original, who has become slightly obsessive about bringing justice to the Sawyer family. He recognizes the bloody scene as their handiwork at once, and dramatically sets off to not really do anything for a bit. The next we see of him, he looks more like a corpse than that dead body that Leatherface was parading around with. Stretch offers Lefty the cassette tape, in order to help his case, while also potentially boosting her career. Smart. Perhaps out of a need to protect her, perhaps out of a need to sit in this hotel room and further turn into a bowl of bone meal, Lefty rejects her and the tape.
Don't think you can barter with me like one of those damned shopkeepers.
With her career opportunities dashed, Stretch returns to LG, and together they provide coverage of a local chili competition, which is won by a very familiar, unforgettable face.
Wait, I know you.
Not all hope is lost. Lefty has a change of heart when sampling some chainsaws. After employing the very worst chainsaw etiquette and terrifying the hearts and minds of a generation of budding health inspectors, Dennis Hopper evolves into Dennis Chopper. He returns to Stretch and asks her to play the tape on air. Stretch complies and gets around the iffy legal side of things by playing it during the request segment of her show. Technically, it was a request. The cook, Drayton Sawyer, overhears the screaming discourse and orders his family to fix their mistake pronto. Being unknowingly used as bait by Lefty, Stretch waits at the station after hours, but is instead met by a previously unseen Sawyer family member, Chop Top, famously portrayed by Bill Moseley. The then unknown actor was cast after creating and starring in a parody, The Texas Chainsaw Massacre.
We should celebrate with some head cheese!
Tobe Hooper was a fan of this short film and kept Moseley in mind should he ever make a sequel. And he did.
Duh.
Anyway, the plot continues on as the Sawyers terrorize Stretch and kidnap her inside their new dwellings. Gone is the eerie, all-too-real rural Texas home. Here, it is replaced with a vast underground cave network thing. Stretch endeavors to make her escape, while Lefty is fully content with
Bring it all down! I'm bringing it down! Down, down! Ah! Ah! Bring it all down! Ah! Ah!
So, yes, the Texas Chainsaw Massacre 2 is stupid, strange, and surreal, but I can't deny that I find it weirdly engrossing. It leans heavily on the comedy, so I can appreciate why horror audiences and die-hard fans of the original will despise it.
Damn property taxes fuck up everything!
Much of the comedy comes from the incessant wackiness of the cannibal family, but there are a number of great jokes that do stand out to me. Leatherface ditching the massive chainsaw to use a tiny bread slicer, or Leatherface's chainsaw acting as a phallic symbol that, when rejected, suddenly fails to operate. I will confess that the humour or tone does not always land for me. The chances of Stretch stopping on the exact spot that just happens to be a trapdoor is a coincidence that I suppose could be brushed over in light of the film's overall zaniness. But the bickering of the family does really begin to drain me towards the end.
Bringing in the sheaves! Bringing in the sheaves! Oh, shut up! Paradise!
It is consistent with the characters, but the film just needed a tad more variety, or perhaps more breaks between the same old badman banter. Less bickering, more chainsaw duels, I say. Mind you, Tiger on the Beat came out just 2 years later and blew this film's chainsaw on chainsaw battle out of the chili pot. If we set aside the crazy hijinks for just one moment, the Texas Chainsaw Massacre 2 still manages to deliver some scenes of real intensity. The aforementioned bridge scene is one such example. The entire sequence in the radio station where Stretch faces off against Chop Top and Leatherface is genuinely tense. Chop Top is so unhinged and unpredictable. You really feel for the poor woman. I'm sure many of my lady friends could attest to being cornered in similar situations. Although, Hopefully they weren't cornered by a deranged Vietnam veteran who heats up a coat hanger to scratch off flakes of skin and eat them. Apologies to anyone who was eating a snack just now. Unless you were chowing down on some of your own skin, of course. In that case, bon appetit. While this sequence also makes Leatherface into an impotent and often ineffectual character, it still hits you with a great jump scare or two to remind you of the teller.
And maybe the new music's...
The location itself appeals to me. The lighting is all very pretty for sure, but I'm impressed that it takes a setting so far removed from the original's locations, yet still pulls off a similar effect, due to the claustrophobia. The second half of the film features less of these scenes than I would like, but there are neat touches here and there. Lefty finding the remains of Franklin after all this time, with the victim's torch burning out, is a nice little stab of emotion to push Lefty to the absolute brink, enabling him to, yes,
Take it all down! Bring it all down!
the scene where Leatherface takes his new skin mask, but makes Stretch wear it instead, is disgusting. It is mostly played for yucks and comedy, but in principle, it's up there with anything shown in the original. It's not a flawless film, and I mostly take issue with it once it arrives at the weird cave location. I'm glad that the grandpa was still alive and kicking, and Tom Savini's makeup work is noteworthy, but simply recreating the famous dinner scene was a mistake. Considering the entire experience so far has been distancing itself from what came before, it suddenly makes the film feel like one of those cheap cash-in sequels that literally just repeat their predecessor. Although, this is 1980s Tobe Hooper we're dealing with here. Maybe it was intentional. A cynical spotlight on the nature of all these franchises of the era. This, and the entire tone, kinda comes off like Hooper doesn't actually like his original work that much, and is effectively trying to.
Bring it all down!
Beyond that, Stretch escapes and has a standoff with Chop Top that drags on too long, and fails to deliver a satisfying climax after such a build-up. I do like that the adventure ends with Stretch emulating Leatherface's saw dance, but most of the revenge was really dealt with by Lefty. I'm not trying to take away the victory from her, but I would have liked to have seen her deal more damage. At any rate, it's a nice spin on the original, where many criticise it for violence against women. Here, all the characters who die, from beginning to end, are men, with a woman emerging victorious. That is interesting to note, although it is perhaps lessened considering Stretch is basically the only woman in the whole picture. To conclude this entry, I credit Hooper and the gang for having the guts to go so off the rails. Sometimes it shines, sometimes it gives me a murky headache, but it is always beautifully weird. After the Texas Chainsaw Massacre 2, despite the mixed reception, 2 more sequels were thrust upon us. The general consensus, however, was that by the 4th film, the Texas Chainsaw Massacre: The Next Generation, the franchise had royally shat the bed. A remake in 2003 was therefore tentatively welcomed, and was eventually well received, but we'll get to that another day. That film's success warranted a prequel, which also did alright for itself, but in 2007, Platinum Dunes announced they were calling it a day. Enter Lionsgate. Were they going to make another remake so soon? Would they try and integrate themselves into the recent Platinum Dunes timeline, if that was even allowed? Would they make the Texas Chainsaw Massacre 5 Deep Space Nine? Given the studio's options in this situation, I don't blame them for tossing aside everything apart from the 1974 classic. And so, we were given the second attempt at a direct sequel, simply named Texas Chainsaw, or Texas Chainsaw 3D. Texas Chainsaw 3D begins with a handy highlight reel of the original film's best bits. Get comfy with a cool glass of iced tea and reminisce about the good times. Like when Leatherface hung a girl on a hook, or this dude went absolutely splat. Sprat. It is a useful tool to assist people who hadn't seen the original, such as the film's stars, Trey Songz and Alexandra Daddario. In a curious move, the credits bugger off and give way to a direct continuation from the events of the first film. A sheriff named Hooper, get it, rides up to the house where the murders had just occurred. Inside, the family that we knew were there, Leatherface, Drayton, and Grandpa, are joined by a whole howdy-doody host of other family members, including a little baby cannibal. Yeah, where did these mugs manifest from suddenly? I guess there was a small time jump? It's possible that Drayton got straight on the blower and organised a good old-fashioned hold-down. I do like how Drayton is now portrayed by none other than Bill Moseley. He is also joined by Gunnar Hansen, the original Leatherface, now playing a guy called Boss Sawyer, and John Dugan reprised his role as Grandpa. Later on, Marilyn Burns, the original Final Girl Sally, portrays Verna Sawyer. These might all be minor roles, but it's nice of the filmmakers to pay their respects. I digress. Sheriff Hooper has his authority pummeled by the arrival of the mayor and a convoy of enraged gun-toting locals. A shootout goes down, and the house is burned to ash. All Sawyers are presumed dead, except for the baby, which is taken in by one of the gun-toting locals. It's a nice gesture, kind of, which is made unfortunately comical by a blow to the mother's face, which is blunt in more ways than one. Time jump. It is now present day, so it's been about 39 years since the Sawyers were defeated, and the baby has grown up to be a 25-year-old. Yeah, the timeline doesn't add up. Screenwriter Adam Marcus stated that their original script was set in the 90s, but the studio pushed for the modern setting and fucked it all up. Adam Marcus is frustrated about that. Fair enough. But I'm not going to sweat it too much. The baby is now called Heather, played by Alexandra Daddario, who works in a supermarket cutting meat. Nature or nurture, you can't escape your family's destiny. Speaking of which, Heather learns that her grandmother has now died, despite thinking that both her grandmothers were already dead. Sadly for her, this bonus grandma revelation teaches her that she is in fact adopted. But she has inherited a nifty mansion down south. Silver linings. Heather takes a trip to Texas, joined by her friends Ryan, Kenny, and American Stacey Solomon.
I literally know nothing about nothing. Like, my top lip is dry. Terrible. Bruise. It's scary. It takes over. My armpits are like, gonna be fine, gonna be fine, gonna be fine.
The camera seems magnetically drawn to her arse. But whoa, hold on, it's okay. It's just a homage. They also pick up a hitchhiker, because this is a Texas Chainsaw Massacre film, and that always goes well, right? They are given the keys to the mansion by a dude named Farnsworth, who is very eager to get out of there.
So long, suckers!
A wise decision. While the house is an extravagant surprise, turns out that the property also comes with a basement and a fitted Leatherface. From that point, you get what you paid for. Running, screaming, killing, screaming, running, and to be fair, it also provides a somewhat different ending for this franchise. Texas Chainsaw 3D was much maligned at release. I didn't hate it back then, and I don't really hate it now. Honestly, I think it's a rather serviceable slasher. The premise is just corny enough with the spooky inheritance cliche. Super Daddario, what is he? Is wearing the most powerful eyeshadow of all time.
I don't know where to start.
Leatherboy is wearing what appears to be a very comfortable knit. I like that when they try and run down a gate, it completely backfires for once. It manages a decent angry mob versus evil villain plotline without once mentioning that
evil dies tonight.
There's enough kills sprinkled in throughout, gory enough to satisfy that itch. And there are a handful of spectacular sequences. Heather trapped in a coffin as Leatherface soars through, being stuck in the car as the villain creeps up, the whole carnival sequence. It's nice to see Leatherface operating in a busy area, even if it does end with his little Zoidberg moment.
Put it down!
Just like the earlier attempt at making a sequel, there are plenty of flaws too. Like most 3D films, the parts that utilize the 3D effects come across as silly and disperse any immersion that you may have had, especially when watching a version that's converted back into 2D. Distracting and cheap. There's the previously mentioned timeline issue, which you can overlook, but you have to admit is pretty fucking clunky. Some of the CGI blood is aged pretty poorly. There is a pointless subplot about Trey Songz cheating on Heather, but it has no payoff. Even after Heather's character turn, she never gets revenge. I don't think she even finds out about it. All it does is add more horniness to a film that is already too horny for a franchise about human chili balls. There's also an extended sequence that slows the film to a halt towards the end of the second act, where Heather learns all about what happened in the 70s, while the mayor and the cops very slowly fuck up the situation further. Maybe the opening flashbacks should have occurred here. It would have added some mystery to both the plot and Heather's character. As it stands, we know there was a Sawyer baby, and that she grows up to be Heather. We know that the birthmark is actually a burn from her mother's necklace. Meh. It would also add some variety and flavour to this discovery sequence, helping to build up to the third act face-off. And yes, I have to mention, there is also the greatest or the worst line in cinematic history, depending on your point of view.
Do your thing, cuz. Do your thing, cuz. Do your thing, cuz.
Yeah, Heather eventually teams up with Leatherface, and the latter becomes a sort of anti-hero. It's an odd choice. People do glorify slasher villains as they root for some gnarly kills and post fan art on their social medias. But it's another thing entirely to see a film lean into that viewpoint directly. Rewatching the film for this video, it didn't bother me as much this time. The mayor and his cronies are right dickheads who deserve being cut down to size. Heather is treated very harshly just because of her family name, so I get why she might switch sides. Although, Leatherface did also violently murder some of her friends, so it's iffy either way. I don't know. In the end, I admire that they went in another direction again, with Heather coming home to play happy families with her long-lost cousin. Quite sweet, really. Less than a decade after Texas Chainsaw 3D, we have been presented with yet another direct sequel to the 1974 film. Aren't we so fortunate? Much like death, it was inevitable. Legacy sequels come for us all. The 1986 sequel was borderline slapstick, and the 2013 edition was still a trashy B-movie in terms of tone. Therefore, along comes the confusingly named Texas Chainsaw Massacre to finally give us the serious direct sequel. Let's look at one of the posters they put out to show. What the fuck? The fuck is that? Oh, maybe I was confused, and this is actually a legacy sequel to The Goonies. Jesus, he looks like a little kid that's been told by his mum that it's time to go. Please, Mom, 5 more minutes. Texas Chainsaw Massacre takes place in modern times, almost 50 years after the initial massacre. A carload of kids are travelling to Harlow, Texas, to sell off their dilapidated properties and revitalise the area. Yep, it's a plot about smug city kids getting in over their heads in an old-fashioned rural southern state. Okay, so yeah. The African-American driver is pulled over by white cops. There's a whole dispute over an old Confederate flag. Ooh, the gentrification. People squabble over the right to own guns. And there's a subplot about a school shooting that the final girl, Lila, previously survived. In other words, most of the discourse over this film has already boiled down to the same petty arguments between those who resemble the gang in the film and the loudmouth anti-woke brigade. I don't give a fuck about any of that, except how it impacts the story and the characters within the film itself. As it stands, it creates a large barrier between the outsiders and the locals, and that's that. Lila takes an interest in the original massacre, soaking up all the intrigue and horror. In this version, Leatherface's identity was never confirmed, and he went missing for half a century. Lila buys Chekhov's chainsaw corkscrew from the store owner, who, wait a minute, look, Scott Shelby alert.
My name's Scott Shelby. I'm a private detective.
I love it when any of the 4 main actors from Heavy Rain appear unexpectedly in a film, especially when it's Sam Douglas, aka our Lord and Saviour, Scott Shelby.
Two fuckers.
After pissing off all the locals they cross paths with, the gang eventually makes it to Harlow. They enter one of the old buildings, an orphanage, but it turns out it's still occupied by an older woman and a large lumbering silent dude. Who could that be? The lady claims she still has the right to stay here, but the kids claim otherwise, quite rudely stating that she has to bugger off. Spoilers from here on out, guys, I guess. The drama is too much for the old bat, and she eventually croaks en route to the hospital. The large, lumbering, silent dude doesn't like that, no sir, not one bit. Something snaps inside his brain, and in turn, he snaps the policeman's wrist and uses it to puncture the poor sod's own neck. Hardcore. The rest of the plot features a very angry Leatherface seeking revenge for the untimely death of his mummy or surrogate mummy, whichever, whatever, because it turns out she did indeed have the right to stay in that orphanage. Awkward. The big takeaway from this sequel is how utterly brutal Leatherface is. I know he lives in the hot and humid land of Texas, but he seriously has no chill. The kills are plentiful, and the kills are bloody. The centerpiece of the movie, and one of the major talking points online, has been the party bus scene. To escape from the rain, all of the hipster investors crowd into their bus to continue the festivities. After a rather cringe moment where some annoying wad of stale cum tries to cancel Leatherface,
try anything you cancel, bro.
The slasher icon unleashes an absolute tempest upon them all. It goes on, and I must admit, it was quite satisfying. In one scene alone, the film manages to stack up a body count that surpasses the other films of the franchise. Question. How fucking old is Leatherface at this point? It's been 50 years since he slaughtered a disabled guy in the woods. If we are generous and say that he was, say, 20 in the original, he's still 70 goddamn years old here. Maybe the elderly are built differently out there in Texas. I don't know. Who am I to judge? His rampage is sparked by the death of the elderly mother figure. Like Vin Diesel, Leatherface was always about family. But the specificity of this woman's death triggering his spree treads a little too close into Jason Voorhees territory for me.
Mother is talking to you.
Or Norman Bates for that matter. But then, Psycho and Texas Chainsaw were both somewhat vaguely inspired by Ed Gein, America's original mother's boy. So I suppose that tracks too. I didn't even mention in the synopsis before that the filmmakers opted to bring back Sally, the final girl from 1974. She's been living off the grid, preparing for her eventual revenge, cutting up meat and shit. Yeah. The shadow of Halloween 2018 hangs heavy over this whole plot. Suffice to say, it worked better in that film. Laurie Strode was always more of a fighter. The only thing Sally battled was her mortal nemesis, Windows. It's upsetting to me that after escaping the Sawyer household, Sally just hung around nearby, only to finally take action half a century later, put some kids in jeopardy, then just die in a literal pile of trash. No offense to Sally or actress Marilyn Burns, but Jamie Lee Curtis's association with Laurie has always been a stronger link. Even worse, Marilyn passed away in 2014, so Sally is recast here. I don't know why they bothered to add this subplot, other than to echo the success of Halloween. Sorry, didn't work for me. What also didn't work for me is that the characters are irritating and unlikable, as is annoyingly almost always the case these days. They're constantly at odds with each other, and it's awkward to be around them. I also find Lila's backstory of surviving a school shooting to be a little tasteless, if I'm honest. It would be a different story if she rose up from this serious trauma to properly fight back against Leatherface and vanquish him, but no. It is Angry Bird's girl who delivers the so-called final blow, and even then, it's an obvious fake-out. The end to this odd character arc is Lila trapped in a self-driving car, watching as her sister is decapitated by an elderly farmer. Now, I'm not against bleak endings, but this falls flat. I'm not sure what it is that makes a bleak ending feel earned or not. The Great Silence makes me want to down a bottle of whiskey and bury my face in the snow, but I love it. Even in horror terms, the original European ending of The Descent is the one that everyone champions. With this film, I'm not sure. The school shooting angle makes me feel yicky in a bad way, and it feels pointless. The status quo remains the same. Everyone is dead, and in a post-credits sting, Leatherface returns to his old home. Meh. People spit on Texas Chainsaw 3D, but at least it had the hairy balls to leave us with a new equilibrium. Ooh boy, don't go just yet. It's time for me to offer my verdicts. Best villains. While 2022 was the most brutal Leatherface, and 2013 gave us Leatherface in his comfy knit, the best villains are of course from 1986. It is the only one of these sequels that understands but the original Texas Chainsaw Massacre was more than just Leatherface. It is the fucked up family unit as a group that really makes the original tick, and the same can be said for the first sequel. Yes, Leatherface himself is consistent with the first portrayal, and it's nice to have Grandpa back. As I said before, he looks great. Chop Top became a cult horror icon for a reason, and Drayton gets more to do than he did before. Best ensemble. On top of the villains, the Texas Chainsaw Massacre 2 also gives us two likeable heroes in the form of Stretch and Lefty. LG is a fun addition too. May he forever be spitting in heaven. Best final girl. For this category, I'm going with Texas Chainsaw 3D and Heather. And no, it's not just because of the metallic blue eyeshadow. Not completely anyway, Jesus. Campy as it may be, I enjoy her story as a secret Sawyer baby, and her eventual conclusion by her cousin's side. Best overall kill. By both quantity and sheer brutality, the new Texas Chainsaw Massacre easily takes this one. Best kill. There are many to choose from across all three films. The final kill of the mayor in Texas Chainsaw 3D might have won this one if it was performed with practical effects. However, I am giving it to the aforementioned scene in the new film, where Leatherboy breaks the guy's bone and uses it as a weapon. Creative and resourceful. Best film. Even though it admittedly loses me a bit in the second half, I am awarding Best Film to The Texas Chainsaw Massacre 2. I adore the first half, and overall, it is such a strange little film that I can't help but gravitate towards it. Well, shit. We made it, guys. I'm knackered. But tell me your thoughts, your opinions on this matter. Which is your favourite? Do you hate any of these? Who's your favourite girl? Or favourite lover boy? Etc. etc. Well, until the next time, friends of the Blowfish.